Hi, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about mentor text. So I'm Kyle.
I'm Annie. So basically, a mentor text is a piece of literature or a piece of writing that you would give to your students as a means of sort of showing them like how you should or should not write something. So I'm gonna go ahead and start. My mentor text that I chose was a personal narrative by Gordon Lewis, and it's called The Man Box. And I'm just going to read it to you guys first. So it says, "We're all average boys, hardworking in school, spending every minute together in the summer, and doing our best to pretend we don't have a worry in the world. The facts are no different as the sun is beginning to set on a warm July evening. Sam and I say goodbye to Ben, stepping out of our best friend's house. My sister is going to pick us up while we're walking. Is that okay, I ask? Yeah. Actually, she can probably drive you home, too. Sounds good, says Sam, but lacking his usual upbeat comedic energy. Neither of us says anything else, but I'm okay with it. We just keep walking. I look around, admiring the still, peaceful park as the warm summer breeze brushes across my face. The crickets are chirping, and an owl sings along between the soft hum of cars rolling along nearby. It's nature's tune of serenity. I almost forgot Sam was with me until he asked, "Can I ask you kind of a weird question?" "Sure," I say, expecting a joke in poor taste as per usual. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to," he says before asking. More hesitantly, I say, "Okay. Do you have someone that you talk to about the deeper stuff, like more emotional stuff?" Silence hits us like a brick wall. The crickets stop chirping, the owl stops hooting, even the cars stop driving by. It's deafening. I'm only shocked at the question because it's Sam, one of the happiest and funniest people I know. I'm wondering. My disappointment takes over just as quickly as my hope fades as I fail to come up with a name. In the end, the closest thing I can think of is a book I occasionally write in when I'm feeling sad or stressed. Huh, I say quietly. I've never really thought about that, but I guess not. Yeah, I didn't either. But at camp, we did activities and had talks that led to more emotional conversations. I'm silently both jealous and proud of him, but it's mostly jealousy. It's funny, I say. In English, we always joked about that TED Talk guy talking about the man box, but it's actually so true. We shouldn't feel like we can't talk about deeper stuff like that. Yeah, laughs Sam. Silence drapes over us again, but this time it's more comfortable. I'm lost in my thoughts, trying to think of what to say next, but there's too much. I've never had an opportunity like this before. However, it's not shocking or overwhelming, even though it's with Sam of all people. Instead, it's therapeutic. The silence is broken once again by Sam. Like, I never told you guys that my parents got divorced. I'm sorry, I say. That really sucks. I'm disappointed in myself for not saying more. It's okay, Sam says, but I know he's lying. I can feel his sadness. Drowning in my thoughts, I try to pick out something to say, but there's too much to say. There are too many options after being silent for 16 years. Headlights appear in front of us, and for a split second I'm relieved, but it rapidly turns into regret. Knowing it's Rose, I quickly tell Sam, "If you ever want to talk again, just let me know." I say hi to Rose, masking my solemn, thoughtful mood as tiredness. The warm breeze gives my cheek one final kiss. Nature resumes her number, and the cars roll by again as Sam and I reluctantly step into the car. So that's the text that I chose, and I would say I think that this text I chose specifically because I think it takes a really casual conversation that would be like had between like two friends, and it brings it into like a denser and profound overall message. So for example, like he starts off with, "We are all boys," but we're not all boys, and we're not all kids. This was a text that was read primarily by adults in the New York Times. That's where it was published. And but he's inviting the reader to step into this role of a teenage boy, and I think that is a really good thing that you could introduce to your students, inviting them to, as writers, inviting their readers into stepping into the role of themselves during that narrative. So whether or not they're talking about a instance from whenever they were 9 or whenever they were 17, you can tell your students to and encourage them to bring the reader into that experience.
Because it makes it much more personal to the reader when they put themselves in the shoes of the person that is writing the text. That it's much easier for them to relate if they think about what that mentality must be like and what that time period in someone's life must be like.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing the writer does in this text is he introduces the characters of the text without stopping the plot of the narrative. So when he introduces his friends, he says, Sam and I say goodbye to Ben stepping out of our best friend's house. So that makes it very clear that he and Sam are really good friends. There's his friend named Ben, and the three of them are really close. And so it kind of sets the tone of who the characters are without saying Sam, comma, my best friend, or Sam, comma, a really good friend of mine who's really funny and usually cracks jokes all the time. Rather, it makes the parts of who Sam is as a part of the narrative. So it brings up, like, Sam is asking me this really solemn, serious question, which is unexpected because he's such a funny guy. And so that's something else that you could encourage your students to do as well when they're writing a personal narrative, is introduce the characters in that narrative throughout the plot, using plot devices in the narrative rather than stopping the narrative to explain the characters. I think that the usage of the park setting, talking about where they are, I love how the writer kind of stops the scenery around them matches the tone with which he's speaking.
Mm-hmm.
So at first it's this you can hear the owl hooting, you can hear the cars rushing by, they're just casually strolling along, and the second that something serious starts going on, everything is silent. And I think that is really profound, and it's a really good device that the writer uses that I would encourage my students to use as well.
It's a great use of symbolism,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that it also kind of points out that likely not all of those things stopped happening in reality. They probably continued to happen, things probably did not go silent, but that explains how that question made the reader feel, or the writer feel rather, and how it kind of stopped everything in time for him. And how it caused a lot of introspection that he probably wasn't expecting. And so I think that although we as readers understand that cars were probably still moving by and that owl was probably still hooting, it just shows that in his mind everything else faded away because he wasn't expecting something that serious, that it happened very abruptly. So I think that that's a very cool device to state how he was feeling without actually giving his emotions.
Yeah, exactly. And so I also came up with a couple of questions that you can ask your students whenever they're reading this mentor text. I would always encourage my students to kind of engage with the text by including some thought-provoking questions after the reading of the text. So some of the questions that I thought of for this specific example are, how does the author take this normal evening conversation with his friend and turn it into something very profound? So we've talked about some of the ways that the author does do that, and that's what I would want my students to look at, is how does this writer take a casual conversation and say something much deeper through it. Another question that I thought of is that this conversation is a couple of lines of dialogue, and it probably only lasted about 5 minutes, but it leaves the reader with so much impression. Think of an occasion where you may have had a conversation with someone that meant more than just what was said. How can you translate the unsaid words of that talk into words for the reader? So I think that is really what the intent behind this specific mentor text was that this was a really simple conversation that was had, but for the author, for the writer, it was a really important conversation for him. And so when your students are writing college essays or personal narratives, you would want them, they're probably going to tell you oh, my life is pretty boring. Things don't really happen in my life. But everyone has moments in their life that they can look back on and be oh, that was important. and how can you take that really simple moment in your life and express the importance of it to the reader without necessarily losing the casualness of the incident in your own life.
Absolutely, and especially because what he was doing was pretty mundane. He was leaving his best friend's house and walking home and getting picked up by his sister, which is something that a lot of people can relate to. They have probably done that, and it just, even if that person were to say, oh, my life is boring, it still shows the necessarily like the mundaneness of what's going on, but it also highlights that something much deeper happened as a result of that. And so I think that that's really cool. I think that's an awesome text.
Yeah, so that's all I have for my text. What did you do?
Awesome. Well, I'm going to shift us gears quite a lot. So the text that I have chosen is much darker and much less profound, but still equally as fantastic in my opinion. So I've chosen a short story called The Landlady by Roald Dahl. I read this years ago in the 8th grade. So, I mean, how many years ago is that now? Probably like 7 years ago that I read this text, and I still remember it to this day because I think that it's just so well done. So it's a little too long for me to read, so I'm going to kind of walk you through the plot and tell you what happens in it, and then go into why I've chosen this as my mentor text and what I think that people can kind of gain out of reading it. So basically, the short story follows a young man named Billy Weaver. He is 17 and he is going off to work, and he needs somewhere to stay for the night. And so he wanders his way into a little bed and breakfast that's a little bit off the beaten path. And so he walks in to this bed and breakfast, and there is an old woman who is the landlady there. And so she is kind of the owner and the patron of this bed and breakfast. And she invites him in and talks to him. And when he asks for how much it is, he thinks that it's fantastically cheap. And she even says, even though he thinks that, she says if that's too much, she can perhaps reduce the price a tiny bit. And so at first, everything seems normal in this text. And there are some eerie things that kind of go on throughout the text as it builds. So one particular little paragraph here, it says, this is her speaking, the landlady is speaking here. She says, everything is always ready day and night in this house, just on the off chance that an acceptable young gentleman will come along. And it is such a pleasure, my dear, such a very great pleasure, when now and again I open the door and see someone standing there who is just exactly right. So things start to seem a little bit off. He actually uses the term off her rocker to describe the landlady. And so as it kind of goes on, she walks him through the house and gives him the tour. And he says that he wants to go off to bed. And she says, you must sign into my book. That is the rule and the law of the land. So you have to sign into my guest book. And as he signs in, he sees that there are only 2 other entries in the text book. Like in the book, there are only 2 other entries. And both of the names start to sound familiar to him. And he says, now where on earth had he heard that rather unusual name before? And so he starts trying to piece together where he's heard this name before. And he says that he thinks that both of these people must be famous. And he says that in his memory, he thinks that they are connected in some particular way, like they were both famous for the same sort of thing. And then he's almost positive that he had seen them in the newspapers. So this tension is building. And as he's talking to the landlady and describing what he's trying to remember, and he's kind of piecing it together, and he's telling her, no, I think they were in the newspapers. And he says here, wasn't that the name of the Eton schoolboy who was on a walking tour through the West Country, and then all of a sudden, and she cuts him off as she's serving him tea and says, milk and sugar. So she's trying to steer the conversation away. So the reader is now understanding that something a little bit darker is going on here, although we're not certain what. And as it continues, he basically asks the main character, Billy, he asks when they left. And she said, left? But my dear boy, he never left. He's still here. Mr. Temple, the other man in the book, is also here. They're on the 3rd floor, both of them together. And so that just seems a little bit eerie.
Yeah.
And then the landlady starts to say some very creepy things to him, talking about one of the men, and said there wasn't a blemish on his body. His skin was just like a baby's. So things are obviously now very creepy, and we don't know exactly what's going on. And then he notices that this lady has pets in her home. She has a parrot and she has a dog. And Billy realizes that both of these animals are stuffed. They are not real. They were real at one point and alive at one point, but they are now taxidermied. And he said, "Who did this? They're incredible." And she said, "I did." And then she says, "I stuff all my little pets when they pass away." And here's where we get the most important part of the piece. We're right at the end here. That he says, she asks if he will have another cup of tea, and he says no. He says the tea tasted faintly of bitter almonds, and he didn't care for it much. And so basically, he obviously doesn't understand this, but as a reader, we can see that that is actually poison in his drink. So you may not know that right off the bat, but that was explained to me all those years ago in the 8th grade that I believe it's arsenic is the poison that actually tastes like almonds.
Yeah.
And she asks if he signed the book, and he says, because later on, if I forget what you were called, then I can always come down here and look it up. And then the story ends with her basically saying that no one else has been there in 2 years. That he says, "Haven't there been any other guests here except them in the last 2 or 3 years?" And she says, "No, my dear, only you." And that's how it ends. So the reason that I've chosen this for my mentor text is because the story doesn't really say much. It takes place over the span of maybe an hour and a half, and he is just in the landlady's home. But the way that it builds throughout the piece shows that there's something much darker going on, and it's kind of we're having the realization as the main character, Billy, is having the realization that something is going on, and he doesn't even come fully to understand exactly what's going on or what's going to happen to him shortly. And I think that that's really fantastic that Roald Dahl here does not specifically state exactly what has happened to these people in the past, what is going to happen to Billy. He never states that there is a threat to him. These things are all implied through the context and through the word choice and through the reader inferring and drawing their own conclusions. So as opposed to telling exactly what's going on and what's going to happen, he makes it more of a thought-provoking piece that you kind of have to sit on and think about what's going on and draw those conclusions for yourself. And very dark, but we do come to realize that she has killed both of these men by poisoning their teas, and she has stuffed them, and she keeps them on the 3rd floor of her home. And she waits for new eligible bachelors to come in that she can also kill and stuff, which is terrifying and very dark to be reading that in the 8th grade. But it was fascinating, and it was just a really excellent example of how it's very important to not always state exactly everything that's going on in the text and to allow your reader to draw those conclusions, because this is much more profound of a piece, much more memorable, and it takes a lot more talent and skill, I would say, than writing exactly what was going on and saying she has killed them and stuffed them.
Yeah.
And so I think that basically what we can do with this text and give this to our students is to kind of teach them that they are able to leave things up to the readers and able to allow the readers to draw their own conclusions, and also for writers to be able to write stories that allow readers to draw those conclusions, and to teach them how profound it is to not tell every little detail of what's going on. It leaves much more mystery, and it makes a piece much more memorable. And so students can incorporate this, especially in their short stories, but they can also incorporate this in other genres of writing as well.
Yeah.
Whether it be longer narratives or personal narratives, that as long as they kind of hint at what's going on, even without stating it explicitly, as long as they use the right clues and build it the right way, it can increase suspense, and it can have the reader much more in tune to what's going on.
Yeah, I love the use of dialogue that he does. Like, he says so much through the conversations that the two characters have, and there's not even a whole lot of, like, details in what, like, factually is going on in the narrative. It's more of, like, the progression of the plot is through dialogue, and I love whenever writers do that. I think it's, like, I can just, like, hear the voices and, like, imagine the conversations happening, like, right in front of me. I love it.
Absolutely. I think it's so cool. And there also, we see it from his perspective being Billy. And so I think it's interesting that it is told from third person, but it's limited. So this third person does not know what's going on in the landlady's head, only knows what's going on in Billy's head.
Yeah.
And so that draws a lot more suspense to it, because if we knew what was going on in the landlady's head, there would be no suspense to the text. We'd know from the beginning exactly what was going on. And so I think that it's a really effective way to tell a story with effectively very little plot.
Yeah.
Almost nothing happens here, but yet the story tells so much and keeps the reader on the edge of their seat. And so I think that that's fantastic, showing that even with minimal plot and very little things going on, you can still tell a very suspenseful, creative piece.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today and hearing about our mentor texts. If you have a mentor text that you really enjoyed, definitely drop it down in the comments below. We would love to read them and pass that knowledge on to our students. Is there anything else you want to say?
Just make sure you like and subscribe, and
ring that notification bell.
We post videos every week, and we can't wait to see you guys next week. So bye!
Thank you. Bye.